Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Have History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and I'm progressing with the Battle of Spotsylvania Court House. Last week I animated the Battle of Yellow Tavern, which happened within the context of the engagement at Spotsylvania Court House. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from the Teespring store or Etsy shop. Thank you. As Union General Philip Sheridan and Confederate General Jeb Stuart battled at Yellow Tavern on May 11th, just a few miles north of Richmond, Union Generals Ulysses S. Grant and George Meade planned their next assault against Robert E. Lee's lines, directing their attention toward the Mule Shoe, a salient in Lee's lines. Grant instructed 2nd Corps Commander Winfield Scott Hancock to move his corps from the right flank to the center around the Brown House. Union Colonel Emory Upton led 12 regiments in an assault that broke the Confederate line at that salient on May 10th, and now Grant planned to use the entire 2nd Corps to crush that salient. Confederate Army Commander Robert E. Lee received word of the enemy movements. Lee was adept at recognizing patterns and predicting how Union commanders would act in situations, but this information led him to a great miscalculation. He mistook the Army movements as meaning Grant was moving east to Fredericksburg to start a new advance toward Richmond. Lee conferred with his corps commanders and decided that if Grant was on the move, then they should strike the Union Army as it moved. He planned to use Ewell's corps to perform this strike, and because the heavy rains made movement slow, ordered Ewell to pull all but 8 artillery pieces away from the Mule Shoe. Over 20 cannons rolled away from the salient. Confederate General Edward Johnson commanded most of the troops at the Mule Shoe, and was astonished to see the pieces roll away. During the evening of May 11th and into the night, Johnson could hear troops marching, halting, and chopping bushes and trees in front of the salient. Some kind of assault was imminent. He went to his corps commander, Richard Ewell, and requested the artillery pieces returned. Ewell ordered them back, but rain delayed the message from getting to his artillery chief and delayed the movement of the pieces back to the salient. The movement of troops heard by Johnson was Hancock's 3 divisions moving into place. Hancock met with his division commanders about 7 p.m. and informed them about their 4 a.m. planned assault. The Union soldiers were already tired. One staffer wrote, "The movement was necessarily slow with frequent halts, at which time the men, worn out by loss of sleep and the terrible nervous and physical strain they had endured during the past 8 days, would drop down for a moment's rest and be asleep as soon as they touched the ground." The front of the marching columns got to the Brown House about 12:30 a.m. Francis Barlow, one of Hancock's division commanders, yelled to a 2nd Corps aide, "For heaven's sake, at least face us in the right direction, so that we shall not march away from the enemy and have to go around the world and come up in the rear." Hancock's corps was packed tightly, with Barlow's division in front, David Birney's division behind them, and John Gibbon's division in the rear. 5 paces separated the regiments, and 10 paces separated brigades. Ambrose Burnside's 9th Corps also formed up to add weight to Hancock's attack, determined to link up with the 2nd Corps' left flank. These troops were poised for a massive assault. 20,000 troops were in Hancock's corps alone. Hancock's troops were aroused about 3:30 a.m. The 2nd Corps commander asked Meade for a delay since a dense fog covered the landscape. Meade agreed, and Hancock waited until 4:30. The attack began with the divisions moving forward. The Pioneer Corps, armed with axes, walked behind the skirmish line to remove any major obstacles in the way. A soldier from Massachusetts remembered, "Neither drum to beat the charge nor bugle to sound the call, none of the accessories that usually accompany warlike forces and give to them pomp and circumstance to fill the eye and feed the imagination were here." There were no officers on horseback, hurrying hither and thither, in front or on either flank, giving life, color, and imagination to the field with their clattering sabers, waving plumes, and brilliant uniforms. Neither were there any picturesque groups of them in the background. Everyone was on foot, for all horses were left behind the lines. James Walker, commander of the Stonewall Brigade, recalled, "The heavy tramp of a large body of infantry and the sharp words of command could be distinctly heard. Very soon our skirmishers came falling back, firing as they came, and announced what we already knew, that a heavy column was advancing to the attack. Our men were all up and ready for them with their muskets cocked, peering through the gloom for the first glimpse of their foes." Hancock's left, because of the darkness in which the men formed for the assault, was going to overshoot the Mule Shoe, but its officers swung it so that it would hit the northeastern portion of the Mule Shoe. When they did so, a gap emerged, and Robert McAllister's brigade of Mott's division filled the hole. When the Confederate soldiers pulled their triggers to let loose volleys into the approaching Federal soldiers, all that sounded was the percussion cap, as the rain had fouled their weapons and prevented them from discharging. This greatly affected the Stonewall Brigade, but others who kept their powder dry were able to send a volley of death into the blue ranks. Without artillery to deliver destruction to the Federals, those Union troops charged into the Confederate works. Before the attack, Hancock ordered his men to fix bayonets and not to stop to fire, so when his troops made it to the enemy entrenchments, it broke down into hand-to-hand fighting. George Maryland Stewart, commander of a brigade that encountered Barlow's division, was captured in the melee. Confederate division commander Edward Johnson, seeing his men desperately fighting, joined them in the combat, wielding his cane against Federal soldiers with fixed bayonets. Eventually, Johnson grabbed a rifled musket and knocked down 15 men before the Union soldiers overpowered him. Captured, Johnson ordered his men to surrender and called out to his enemy not to shoot his troops. The weight of the Union corps was too much, and the Confederate line collapsed. However, the success of the attack led to confusion within the Second Corps ranks. Units lost all cohesion and became more of a mob of soldiers than brigades and divisions. Barlow wrote years later that, "What ought to have been done was plain. We had carried the enemy's line at its extreme right and practically destroyed its defenders. The occasion for charging, for rush and confusion, was past, and troops ought to have been soberly and deliberately put in position and ordered to sweep down the rebel line towards his left, while provision was made to guard against an attack by the enemy's second line, or the remnant of his defeated troops, upon the ground which we had taken." Johnson's division had basically melted away. It entered the wilderness a few weeks prior with over 5,000 men. Now it numbered a little over 1,000, a loss of 78%. To the southeast, Burnside's corps was on the move against the east side of the Mule Shoe. The 23rd and 37th Virginia of Maryland Stewart's brigade and the 28th North Carolina of James Lane's brigade were pushed back by Barlow's men and Burnside's approaching troops, but the rest of Lane's North Carolinians held the Union attacks at bay, doggedly holding on to their ground. New Confederate Division Commander John B. Gordon was Lee's reserves, and reports came in that unusual activity was to the north. He formed Robert Johnson's brigade and moved it forward to hopefully stem the tide of the Union advance. When he did, Johnston himself was gravely wounded, putting Thomas Garrett in command. The North Carolinians were hit by gunfire on three sides and forced to fall back to safety. Gordon, knowing that he needed to buy General Lee some time, ordered Garrett to attack again, but this time spread out his brigade to section off the Federals from penetrating the Confederate line any further. Garrett did as he was asked and moved his men forward. Again, the Federal gunfire hit the Tar Heels from three sides. Even stretching the brigade out didn't make it big enough to cordon off the Federals. Garrett was killed in the action, and Thomas Toone replaced him. The brigade withdrew to safety and awaited additional reinforcements. More were on the way. Gordon gathered Clement Evans' brigade and John Hoffman's Virginians to come to the scene of the action. Lee calmly surveyed the situation as Johnson's men came streaming south. He then rode to Evans and Hoffman's troops. Standing in the middle of them, he removed his hat and turned his horse Traveler toward the enemy. The Georgians told him that they didn't want him killed. Gordon claimed that he grabbed Traveler's bridle and said, "You must not expose yourself. Your life is too valuable to the army and to the Confederacy for you to risk it so wantonly. We are Georgians. We are Virginians. We need no such encouragement." Gordon led the brigades against the fast-approaching mob of blue soldiers. The Federals didn't give up the ground easily, and a volley flew between the two sides. But the more organized Confederates stood more solidly than the loose group of Federals. Confederate brigades, not encountering any enemy forces in their front, were pulled out of the line and rushed toward the now occupied breastworks. Hand-to-hand fighting resulted as Hancock's troops didn't want to give up what they had captured. Northern troops still occupied the northernmost sector of the Mule Shoe and poured lead into the flanks of the Confederates, who recaptured the works. Human gore filled the water puddles caused by the heavy rains. Men used bayonets, the butts of their rifles, and their very fists to attack one another. Every now and then the muskets would fire, and more dead and dying men would pile up higher and higher in the Confederate breastworks. It was now 6 a.m., and Hancock knew that his troops would be completely pushed away from the rebel works if reinforcements didn't emerge. Thomas Neal's division from Horatio Wright's 6th Corps approached the northwest sector of the Mule Shoe to give aid to Hancock's beleaguered troops. However, Ramser's North Carolinians blocked their advance, so the blue troops threw up breastworks and engaged in long-distance exchanges of musketry, all the while ducking behind their hastily made breastworks to avoid artillery fire. When Johnson's line broke, Lee called for William Mahone's division, who guarded the Army's left flank, to come east and help seal the breach. The lead elements arrived about 7 a.m. in a driving rain. Abner Perrin's brigade arrived first. Seeing the chaos in front of them, Perrin remarked, "I shall come out of this fight a live Major General or a dead Brigadier." Gordon guided the Alabamians where they were most needed, and Perrin charged into the breach. The brigade lost all cohesion because of the hectic charge and the fact that Perrin, their leader, was shot off his horse, wounded multiple times, and died from blood loss when a bullet nicked his femoral artery. The brigade broke up into pieces, with many of the men caught in a crossfire from their comrades behind them and enemy troops in front of them. So they hunkered down into some secondary works, awaiting an opportunity to make it to safety. Nathaniel Harris's Mississippi Brigade was next. Near the McCool House, they saw General Lee. An artillery shell passed by Traveler's stirrups, and a member of the brigade yelled out to Lee, "Can't you trust us?" General Lee replied, "Yes, I can trust you. Go, and may God go with you." Others yelled, go back, General Lee. For God's sake, go back." Lee stood up in his stirrups and yelled, "Mississippians, I go back under one condition, and that is that you go forward. Remember that you strike for Mississippi today." Harris charged his men to the right of Ramser's brigade, pushing back more Union troops from the entrenchments, but the gap in the line still remained. On the Union side, communication and cohesion broke down further. Lewis Grant's Vermont Brigade made it to the left of Hancock's line and then moved forward, entering the breastworks of Barlow's division, causing more chaos in the blue ranks, as now Barlow would have to separate his division from that brigade. He rode back to Hancock and told him of the confusion and said not to send any more reinforcements, that it would only make his ranks less coherent. The men from Vermont were supposed to go further southeast to link up with Burnside's right flank, but the orders were vague, so they moved into Barlow's lines. McGowan's South Carolinians from Wilcox's division of A.P. Hill's Corps was the next Confederate brigade to make it to the Mule Shoe. The brigade was prepared to reclaim their reputation after the disaster at the Wilderness and rushed in. Charles Wilden of the 1st South Carolina carried the flag for his regiment. He was afflicted with epilepsy and couldn't keep up with his regiment, but went into the fight anyhow. When a bullet hit him in the shoulder and another broke his flagpole, he ripped the flag from the staff, wrapped it around himself, and charged into the breach. McGowan's men pushed the blue troops out of the northernmost sector of the Mule Shoe, regaining all of the lost ground from the early morning attack by Hancock's 2nd Corps. The brigade lost its commander, McGowan, to an arm wound, and his replacement was killed nearly as soon as he took command, so command went to Joseph Brown of the 14th South Carolina. Emory Upton's brigade charged the reclaimed Confederate works and lost significant casualties in the attempt. His lead regiment lost 100 men just getting to the front because the musketry and artillery fire was so deadly. The brigade fell back with the rest of the 2nd Corps and part of the 6th Corps. Another brigade from the 6th Corps was also preparing for its own assault. Henry Brown's New Jersey brigade fell on the right of Upton's brigade and then attempted to hit Harris's brigade by going in between the Union and Confederate lines. The Southern soldiers played havoc on the right flank of the brigade. Miraculously, they made it to the Confederate entrenchments, and it quickly devolved into hand-to-hand combat, but the enormous casualties sustained during the attack made the brigade fall apart rather quickly. A man in that brigade recalled the scene later. "Terrific day of awful, murderous conflict. Combine the horrors of many battlefields, bring them into a single day and night of 24 hours, and the one of May 12th includes them all." One Union soldier remembered that dead rebels were piled in the entrenchments 3 to 4 bodies deep, and the rain only made life in the trenches worse as men strove to fire their easily fouled muskets. A Union soldier remembered, "The rebels were on one side of the breastwork and we on the other. We could touch their guns with ours. They would load, jump up, and fire into us, and we did the same to them. Almost every shot that was made took effect." Another wrote, "Our men fought the rebels close to the other side of the breastworks and knocked their guns aside, and jumped up in the works and shot them down." It was now just after 12 noon, and the battle for the Mule Shoe broke down into a bitter stalemate, with neither side giving in. Lee knew that his men couldn't hold that position much longer, and ordered what troops were available to construct a second set of earthworks south of the Harrison home. Lee hoped that his men could hold out until this new line was constructed.